The night felt too quiet for a city that never sleeps, like the world had turned down its volume just to listen to the wrong thing. Somewhere below my window, a siren flickered without urgency, a dog barked once and went silent, and the air pressed close as if holding its breath for what was coming. My name is Elena Carter, and I was 27 years old when the first shadow crossed the future I had been carefully sketching for myself. By day, I was a designer in a small studio with creaky floors and big windows. By night, I was a believer, someone who still thought love when found could be a kind of shelter. Daniel had made me believe that. He arrived softly, the way morning light spills across a room. He was simple in the best way, steady, earnest, sincere. Not a sweep you off your feet kind of love, more like the kind that lays down foundation and says quietly you can build here. Problem with foundations is they don't warn you when a fault line is near. I met his father, Richard Wallace, on a Sunday. You don't forget the first time a person looks at you and decides you are a problem to be solved. He was the sort of man who never bent, his posture, his opinions, his plans all ironed flat. His handshake was practiced, his smile efficient, his words shaped like doors he kept the keys to. Felt small talk becoming an inspection. He asked what I did, and when I said design, he nodded in the way people nod when they hear hobby, then dressed his skepticism as concern. Our tea cooled while he arranged the table with invisible lines. He was polite. That was the worst part. Politeness is a blade with a pearl handle. That night I told myself I was imagining things, that I was too sensitive, that people like Richard are intimidating because they fill a room without permission. But in bed with the light off and the world honest again, a thought moved through me like a cold draft. He had not measured me to understand me. He had measured me to remove me. I didn't know about Sophia Reynolds yet. I didn't know about the handshakes shaped like contracts, the backroom talk about families as alignments, the way two men could look at the lives around them like chessboards where love was a pawn and marriage a merger. All I knew was the feeling, the quiet shift you notice when your name stops fitting easily into certain rooms. Till life went on as it stubbornly does. Mornings at the studio tasted like coffee and possibility. The city wore its noise like makeup. I walked to work with my headphones in, letting music coat the spaces anxiety tried to fill. I drew shapes that wanted to be buildings, logos that wanted to be stories, colors that felt like promises. When my phone lit up with Daniel's name, something inside me settled. His voice steadied me the way a lighthouse steadies a coastline you can't always see. Then small things began to change. Invitations to family dinners shifted into "it's just us tonight." Group messages faded into private plans I wasn't part of. A cousin's engagement party appeared on social media like a photograph I should have been standing in. When I asked Daniel, he softened, the way he always did, and said his dad must have forgotten to loop me in. He said it with big, generous eyes. I believed him because I wanted to. One evening, we drove out to a restaurant where the sunset tipped into the glassware and made everything look kinder than it was. A string trio polished the air. I wore a dress that made me stand straight. The entrance, the host scanned the list and frowned politely. My name wasn't there. Pause that followed wasn't long, but it was long enough for me to understand. I smiled because that is a kind of armor, and Daniel, sweet, mortified, insisted we go in anyway. We did. But I felt like a guest at my own life. Inside, I watched Sophia arrive the way fog arrives, soft, assured, inevitable. She glided through conversation like someone who had learned her steps long ago. People greeted her with the kind of warmth that curves, pre-planned around a chosen person. She was beautiful in the curated way magazines teach, and there was nothing cruel about her. That somehow made it worse. You cannot hate a mirror for reflecting exactly what the room expects to see. The details that followed mattered because of how small they were. A laugh that didn't include me. A clink of glasses that did not need my glass. Richard's gaze moving over the crowd, pausing only to approve the picture he'd framed. If I had shouted then, I think the chandelier would have kept shining. The music would have kept playing. The room would have kept calling it charity and family and legacy. I would have been the one out of tune. Later, when the city peeled off its evening and put on its night, I walked home alone and let the streetlights blur. My reflection in the shop windows looked like a ghost trying to understand why she wasn't invited to haunt her own life. In my apartment, I sat on the floor with my back against the couch and listened to the hum of the refrigerator like it was a friend. I opened my sketchbook and drew a single line from one edge of the page to the other, straight as a held breath. It felt like a promise I didn't know how to keep yet. Days turned to weeks the way pages turn in a book someone else is skimming. At work, a client I adored slipped away after a lunch I hadn't known changed locations. At home, my landlord, friendly for 2 years, began to notice scuffs that weren't there, noise I hadn't made, trash I hadn't left. None of it was big enough to argue without sounding paranoid. All of it was sharp enough to leave marks I had to cover with sleeves. I told myself resilience is a practice. I ate carefully, I slept deliberately, I spoke slowly so my words would not betray the pitch of my pulse. I loved Daniel in the same steady way I always had, but I started to hear a new note in his voice when he said his father's name. It sounded like gravity. It sounded like a lifetime of being taught that duty is a synonym for love. The first open sign came dressed as kindness. A Sunday lunch at the Wallace house. Table set like a photograph. The roast tender, the sauce exact, the napkins folded into shapes that felt like expectation. We ate. We smiled. We pretended we weren't performing. After dessert, Richard spoke about opportunities, business growing, partnerships expanding, families finding the right rhythm. He never said Sophia's name. He didn't have to. Absence can be a sentence. When we left, the air outside felt colder than the sky allowed. Daniel slipped his hand in mine and I held it, not because I was comforted but because I needed to remember what softness felt like. In the car, he said maybe I was reading too much into things. I watched the city pass in streaks and didn't answer. I had learned that silence can be a notebook. That night I lined up the facts in my head like photographs on a wall. Invitations missing. Lists edited. Deals whispered. Smiles sharpened. Sophia placed gently in the spaces I had been occupying, as if the room itself had been measured for her. I did not think of revenge. I thought of clarity. I thought of what truth looks like when it stands under bright light and doesn't flinch. I opened my laptop and started a document I named with a word only I would understand. I wrote down dates, names, places, phrases that had felt wrong in my mouth. I attached screenshots that proved nothing and suggested everything. I didn't know what I was building, only that I was tired of being sculpted by someone else's hands. Around midnight, rain began against the window, a soft, persistent sound like a story refusing to be untold. I lay down and watched the ceiling as if it could answer. It didn't. Ceilings are loyal only to gravity. But in the drift between waking and sleep, I felt something small and fierce uncurl inside me, the part that does not accept erasure as fate. The storm outside never hardened into thunder. It didn't need to. Not all storms break things loudly. Some simply soak the ground so the right seed once planted cannot help but grow. When morning came, the city put on its weekday face. I did too. But I tied my hair back like a soldier rolls up a map. Somewhere far above the traffic and the office lights and the schedules, I imagined a thin line stretching taut between what I knew and what I would soon prove. The first shadow had arrived. I wasn't running from it anymore. I was turning to face it, eyes open, pen ready, heartbeat steady enough to hear the hinge of a door beginning, finally, to move. Some battles come with the sound of marching boots. Others arrive as a polite knock on the door, wearing a suit and carrying a glass of wine. Richard Wallace fought the second kind. His weapon wasn't blunt force, it was precision. And I was learning slowly that precision cuts deeper than any blade. The weeks after that Sunday lunch were deceptively calm, like the ocean on the surface while currents tore away at the sand beneath. I went to work, met deadlines, called friends when I could, and pretended to sleep through the night. On the outside, my life looked the same. Inside, I was starting to see the pattern of the trap. Richard didn't attack me outright. That would have been too easy to defend against. Instead, he shifted the ground under my feet an inch at a time. A mutual friend stopped returning my calls. An old client suddenly pulled a project from my hands with the vague explanation of going in a different direction. The coffee shop near the studio, the barista, usually warm and chatty, started greeting me with the stiffness of someone who'd heard a story they couldn't unhear. Daniel noticed only in fragments. He'd say I seemed distracted or tired, that maybe I needed a break from work. I wanted to tell him that it wasn't work draining me, it was his father's slow erosion of the life I'd built. But saying it out loud felt like stepping into quicksand. Then came the first deliberate move I could trace directly to Richard. It was at a networking event hosted by a client of mine, a small interior design firm that occasionally hired me for freelance work. The invitation had come weeks earlier, and I was looking forward to it. But when I arrived, the air in the room felt off. People who usually greeted me warmly offered tight smiles and quick glances over my shoulder, as if waiting for someone more important to arrive. That someone was Sophia. She came in 30 minutes later, hand resting lightly on Richard's arm as they navigated the crowd. Her dress was understated perfection, the kind of elegance that photographs well without looking like it tried too hard. Richard introduced her to the firm's director with a familiarity that spoke of many previous conversations. He didn't introduce me at all. From across the room, I heard him praising her vision for design and her natural understanding of high-end spaces. It was almost laughable. I had never known Sophia to work in design. The words weren't meant for truth, they were meant for replacement. I stayed long enough to be polite, then slipped out into the night. The city air felt warmer than the room I'd left, even under the dim streetlights. The next week, the second move came. I was in the middle of a project when my boss asked to see me. He closed the office door, leaned back in his chair and started talking about client concerns. Apparently, someone had questioned whether I could manage the scale of an upcoming campaign. The client hadn't named their source, but they'd been advised to consider a more reliable designer. It was the same language Richard used at the dinner table, compliments edged with doubt. I left the office with a familiar thrum of adrenaline in my chest. Not fear, alertness. The kind of feeling you get when you know you're being watched. By now, I'd begun keeping records in earnest. Dates, names, events, everything that felt slightly off. The folder on my laptop was growing, and with each new entry my resolve sharpened. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday evening. I ducked into a small cafe to wait out the storm and found myself seated next to two men in suits. They were speaking quietly, but I caught a name, Wallace. I kept my head down, scribbling in my sketchbook while my ears tuned in. They were discussing a shipment delay and a payment dispute. One of them laughed in that bitter way people do when they've been here before. He said Richard had a habit of changing deal terms at the last minute to gain leverage, and that it was starting to cost him partners. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was the first thread I could pull. Days later, another thread appeared, this time in print. A local business journal ran a small piece buried between larger headlines. City Council probes business contracts for possible violations. The article was vague, all alleged irregularities and ongoing review, but the accompanying photo showed Richard shaking hands with a council member. There was no accusation, but there was suggestion. And suggestion in the right hands can be louder than fact. Then came Sophia. She reached out unexpectedly through a short message from an unknown number. We need to talk. Alone. We met in a quiet corner of a public park the next day. She looked uneasy, scanning the space as if someone might see us. When she finally spoke, her words dropped into place like pieces of a puzzle I'd been staring at for months. She told me she didn't want to marry Daniel, that she'd been pressured by her father and Richard for the sake of a business alliance. She admitted she'd heard them discussing ways to make my life harder, so I'd step aside. I didn't show her my shock. Instead, I asked careful questions and stored her answers like valuables. By the time we parted, I knew one thing for certain: this wasn't just interference. This was strategy. And I had just been handed my first real ally. That night, I sat at my desk with my growing folder of notes and screenshots. Richard had power, yes. But now I could see his weak points, connections that could sour, deals that could be questioned, a reputation that could be cracked. For the first time, I didn't just imagine surviving this. I imagined winning. When you spend months as the target of someone's quiet war, you learn patience the way you learn a foreign language, slowly, painfully, until one day you realize you can speak it fluently. By the time Sophia walked out of that park, I wasn't just surviving Richard Wallace's game anymore. I was learning to play it. First step wasn't action, it was observation. I went back through every note in my folder, reading them like chapters of a book I hadn't finished yet. Dates lined up. People overlapped. Patterns emerged. Richard's tactics always followed a rhythm: remove opportunities, replace me with Sophia in public settings, undermine me in professional spaces, then close the social circle so I had nowhere to stand. It was surgical. But even surgeons make mistakes. I started listening more than speaking. In conversations with mutual acquaintances, I let my silence pull out their words. In coffee shops, I positioned myself within reach of whispered business talk. I learned that Richard's company was under increasing strain, not enough to make headlines, but enough to force him into riskier deals. Deals that weren't universally liked. One of those deals involved a supplier I happened to know. A man named Howard, mid-50s, perpetually overcaffeinated, who'd once asked me for branding advice for his small side project. I met him for coffee under the pretense of catching up. It didn't take much nudging before he started venting about Richard's habit of changing contract terms after agreements were signed. The latest change had cost him a client, and he was debating whether to walk away entirely. I didn't tell him to do anything. I just listened, asked for details, and made a mental note of every name he mentioned. Sophia, for her part, was more willing to talk now. She sent me a discreet email with copies of an internal memo about future family alliances, and an agenda from a closed-door meeting outlining projected business benefits if she and Daniel married. It was exactly what I needed, proof that this wasn't personal drama but part of a calculated financial strategy. I filed it carefully, naming it something bland enough to avoid suspicion if anyone stumbled across it. First disruption I caused was small, almost invisible. A well-timed tip to a journalist I trusted, nothing damning, just a question about whether Richard's company might be over-leveraged on certain contracts. 2 weeks later, a short piece appeared in the business section of the local paper. No accusations, just speculation. But speculation plants seeds, and in Richard's world, doubt is a poison. That week, Daniel mentioned over dinner that his father seemed distracted lately. Deals weren't closing as smoothly. Meetings were running longer. He said it without connecting the dots, but I could feel the shift. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just folded my napkin, placed it beside my plate, and thought to myself that for the first time in months, I wasn't just reacting. I was moving. And Richard Wallace had no idea the board was changing. Disruption, I had learned, works best when it's disguised as coincidence. Too obvious and your target digs in, too subtle and they never feel the shift. The sweet spot was somewhere in the middle, just enough to make them wonder if they'd lost their grip. By now, my folder of evidence had grown into something that could almost stand on its own. I had notes from Howard's complaints, Sophia's memos, clippings of business articles that hinted at trouble, and a neatly catalogued list of small incidents that pointed to Richard's influence over my life. I wasn't ready to throw it all into the light just yet, but I was ready to start pulling on the threads. The first one I pulled was tied to a charity event Richard's company sponsored annually. I discovered, thanks to Sophia, that the keynote speaker was a client Richard was trying to impress for an upcoming deal. Through a mutual contact, I passed along an anonymous tip to the speaker's assistant about Richard's tendency to adjust contracts at the 11th hour. I didn't expect an explosion, but I did expect hesitation. Sure enough, the speaker canceled at the last minute, citing a scheduling conflict. The replacement speaker was fine, competent, polite, but lacked the prestige Richard had been banking on. From the outside, it looked like bad luck. From the inside, it was a missed opportunity he couldn't get back. Meanwhile, Sophia continued to feed me scraps of information. She had begun keeping her own notes, recording conversations, and saving documents when she could. She didn't do it out of loyalty to me, at least not entirely. I think she simply wanted her own freedom. One afternoon, she forwarded me an email chain between her father and Richard, discussing potential joint investments tied directly to her and Daniel's supposed engagement. The way they spoke of it was cold, transactional. My relationship was not even a factor, it was a variable to be eliminated. That email went straight into my folder. The second pull came through Howard again. Over coffee, I asked if he'd ever considered talking to the press about his experiences with Richard's contracts. I didn't push, just planted the idea. 2 weeks later, a local business columnist published a piece on predatory contract negotiations in the corporate sector, quoting an anonymous supplier who'd lost business due to last-minute changes. Richard wasn't named, but the description was specific enough for people in the industry to make the connection. I heard about the fallout from Daniel. He mentioned his father had been snapping at people around the office, more impatient than usual. He chalked it up to stress from work. I said nothing, only nodded while quietly adding another checkmark to my mental tally. For the first time, Richard wasn't entirely in control. The edges of his empire were fraying, imperceptible to most, but not to me. I could feel the tension building, like a rope pulled too tight. And I knew exactly how to keep pulling. Every move Richard made was deliberate, and by now I'd learned to expect layers beneath his actions. So when Daniel invited me to lunch on a warm Saturday afternoon, I should have known it wasn't going to be just the two of us. We met in front of a new rooftop restaurant, sunlight glinting off the glass panels that framed the city skyline. Daniel seemed relaxed, his hands tucked into his pockets, the easy smile of someone who thought they were surprising you with something nice. But the moment we stepped inside, my stomach tightened. By the far railing at a table set for 4 sat Richard, his wife, and Sophia. The view behind them was breathtaking, towering buildings, sunlight catching on distant windows, but all I could see was the arrangement. It wasn't an accident. This was staged. Richard greeted me with that same perfectly measured smile, the kind that looked warm from a distance but held no temperature up close. Conversation began light, small talk about the weather, the restaurant's view, the new art exhibit downtown, but it shifted quickly. He started asking questions that were really judgments in disguise. Was my design career truly stable? Did I think it would be sustainable if I had children? Would I be willing to adjust my lifestyle to better suit Daniel's future? Each question was wrapped in civility, but the underlying message was clear. I didn't belong in the picture he was painting. Sophia sat quietly for most of it, her eyes darting between us like she was watching a play she'd been forced to attend. She didn't smirk or gloat, she simply looked uncomfortable, which told me more about her position in all this than any words could. Daniel, oblivious or unwilling to see the tension, tried to keep things light. He laughed at awkward moments, steered the conversation back to safe topics, but the undercurrent was there, heavy, deliberate, and aimed squarely at me. When the check came, Richard insisted on covering it, as though the gesture might smooth over the cuts he'd just made. I thanked him because that's what you do when you're playing the long game. Then I stood, shook his hand, and looked him directly in the eye long enough to see the faint flicker of surprise that I wasn't flinching. On the way home, Daniel apologized, saying he hadn't known his father and Sophia would be there. I believed him mostly. But it didn't matter. Whether he planned it or not, I'd been placed in a situation designed to make me feel small. Problem for Richard was that humiliation only works if you accept it. I didn't. I left that rooftop with more determination than I'd had in months. He wanted me to back down. Instead, he'd just given me more reason to push forward. And this time, I wasn't going to settle for pulling threads. I was going to start unraveling the whole tapestry. The night after the rooftop ambush, I couldn't sleep. The city outside my window pulsed with life, but my apartment felt too still, too full of the words Richard had aimed like darts. I lay in bed thinking about every move he'd made, how calculated it all was. He wasn't just trying to push me away, he was methodically erasing me. But erasure works both ways. And I had something he didn't, a growing collection of his own missteps. The next morning, I opened my laptop and stared at the folder I'd been building for months. It wasn't just notes anymore, it was a living map of his influence. I had screenshots of business articles hinting at trouble in his company, details from suppliers like Howard, and memos Sophia had risked passing to me. I started organizing them chronologically. Patterns appeared, contracts changing just before deadlines, events where Sophia was placed in my stead, anonymous tips that mirrored his language, whispers of partnerships hinging on her marriage to Daniel. It became clear, Richard's business health and his personal vendetta against me were intertwined. The marriage he envisioned wasn't just about family pride, it was leverage. Merging the Wallace and Reynolds names meant merging resources, covering debts, and strengthening his grip on the industry. If I wanted to dismantle his plans, I couldn't just fight him socially. I had to hit the foundation, his credibility. Sophia's next email gave me my first real opening. Contained an internal project report showing projected revenue increases tied directly to expected marital alliance. The phrasing was cold, transactional, and damning. I copied it into a secure drive and hid the physical printout in the lining of an old portfolio case. At the same time, I began reaching out carefully to people I knew on the edges of his professional circle. I didn't ask for dirt. I asked questions that let them talk freely, planting seeds of doubt without pointing fingers. The more I listened, the clearer it became. Richard had more enemies than I thought. They just didn't speak up because they assumed no one could challenge him. I decided to give them someone who could. Through a trusted mutual contact, I passed a discreet tip to a business columnist, a respected one with a record of exposing corporate misconduct. Nothing dramatic, just a nudge. Certain joint ventures between the Wallace and Reynolds groups might not be as mutually beneficial as advertised. 2 weeks later, the columnist published a piece speculating on imbalanced strategic alliances in the local market. No names, but anyone in the industry could decode it. Daniel mentioned one evening that his father seemed edgy lately. Short-tempered in meetings, distracted at dinners. Deals that were supposed to close smoothly kept stalling. He thought it was just bad timing. I knew better. For the first time, I felt the balance shift just slightly, but enough to know the game was no longer his alone. And if Richard Wallace thought I was just holding my ground, he was about to learn I'd been quietly moving forward all along. Pressure changes people. Some dig in, clinging tighter to control. Others crack in small, almost invisible ways. Richard Wallace was still holding his posture, but I could see the faint hairline fractures forming. The first sign came at a charity dinner 2 weeks after the columnist's article. Normally, Richard owned rooms like this, his smile perfectly timed, his laughter the right volume, his presence magnetic. But that night he seemed off. His eyes lingered too long on certain conversations, scanning for words that might be about him. When a fellow businessman slapped him on the back and said something I couldn't catch, I watched his jaw tighten before the smile snapped back in place. It was subtle, but I saw it. The seeds of doubt I'd planted were sprouting. Sophia noticed too. She approached me during the event, not in the shadows as before, but right there in the open. Her voice was low, but her eyes were steady. She told me she was done playing along. She didn't care if her father found out she'd been speaking to me. She was tired of being a bargaining chip, tired of sitting in rooms where men discussed her life like a set of market trends. Her own relationship, something she had kept secret, was serious, and she was ready to protect it. That night, she gave me more than just words. She handed me a slim flash drive, slipping it into my palm as if she were passing me a note in school. On it were internal communications between her father and Richard, outlining contingency plans for the family merger and fallback strategies if Daniel resisted. The language was unmistakable, marriage as a transaction, alliances calculated in percentages. I didn't know it then, but this drive would become the key to everything. With Sophia openly aligned with me, I could move faster. I connected her with the journalist I'd been feeding small pieces of information to, framing her not as a source but as a whistleblower from within the Reynolds orbit. She agreed to speak on background, ensuring her name wouldn't be tied to anything. Yet, at the same time, I kept my own movements quiet. I didn't want Richard to know where the pressure was coming from, only that it was building. I let the press connect the dots between his faltering deals, the whispers about his alliances, and the increasingly visible discomfort in his public appearances. Daniel began to notice more. He mentioned his father being uncharacteristically irritable at home, pacing the office late at night, making phone calls from behind closed doors. He didn't know why things were changing, but for the first time, He admitted he thought his father might be keeping things from him. I said nothing to confirm or deny. Inside, I knew the truth. Richard Wallace had spent months trying to control every move on the board. Now, for the first time, he was reacting instead of directing. And that was the most dangerous position for a man like him to be in. On a gray Monday morning, the city's largest business paper ran a front-page article, "Concerns Grow Over Corporate Alliance Strategies." Richard's name wasn't in the title, but his photograph, shaking hands with Sophia's father, sat squarely beneath it. Peace dissected questionable clauses in recent partnership agreements, comparing them to other deals that had ended in legal disputes. It was careful, not accusatory, but anyone in the industry could read between the lines. The article spread fast. Within hours, smaller blogs picked it up. By the end of the week, the story was on evening news segments, each one subtly chipping at Richard's image as the untouchable businessman. Inside his company, the ripple turned into waves. A supplier pulled out of a key contract, citing a lack of good faith. A junior executive resigned suddenly, posting a cryptic message online about ethical differences. 2 shareholders called for a board meeting to discuss future leadership direction. I didn't have to imagine Richard's reaction. I could see the edges of it on Daniel's face when he told me. He said his father was managing a difficult moment, but the words were stiff, rehearsed. The shine of certainty was gone. Meanwhile, Sophia's role was shifting from secret helper to quiet operator. She began planting her own seeds, turning down public appearances with the Wallace family, attending events with her actual partner, letting her absence speak as loudly as any statement. The alliance Richard had been building in whispers was cracking out loud. At one industry dinner, I watched him try to work a room the way he used to. He still smiled, still moved with authority, but there was a stiffness to it now, a subtle defensiveness. People approached him with the politeness one reserves for someone standing near a fire, careful, measured, ready to step back if it spread. The best part was that I didn't have to force anything. The truth was working on its own now, moving through the cracks I'd helped create. Every deal he'd manipulated, every rumor he'd spread, every calculated slight, it was all catching up to him in ways he couldn't control. Karma wasn't coming for him in one big blow. It was coming in pieces, a delayed contract here, a journalist asking harder questions there, an ally who quietly chose not to return his call. Individually, they were small. Together, they were enough to turn his empire into something fragile. And through it all, I stayed quiet. I didn't need to be loud. The louder he tried to defend himself, the more it looked like he had something to hide. Richard Wallace had built his power on perception. Now I was watching that perception crumble, one headline, one meeting, one unreturned phone call at a time. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning. Richard's company was holding its quarterly investor meeting, the kind of event he'd always ruled with polished confidence. Cameras were set up at the back of the room, journalists lined along one side, shareholders filling the seats. Should have been routine, a stage he knew by heart. But that morning, just hours before he stepped onto the podium, the investigative journalist I'd been feeding information to released her most detailed piece yet. It was the kind of story that didn't just hint at wrongdoing, it laid out a timeline, linked documents, and named the key players. Connected his company's recent strategic alliances directly to personal financial motives, highlighting how the proposed marriage between Daniel and Sophia was positioned as part of a larger merger to consolidate resources. Screenshots of internal memos, ones Sophia had slipped me, were printed in black and white for the world to see. By the time Richard took the stage, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. Shareholders weren't smiling. Journalists weren't clapping politely. Questions began before he could even start his prepared remarks. What did he have to say about the allegations? Were these partnerships negotiated in good faith? How did his family's personal relationships play into corporate decision-making? His answers were smooth at first, but the cracks showed quickly. Practiced charm gave way to sharper tones, the confident stance stiffened into defense. The man who always controlled the room was suddenly on the back foot, and everyone could see it. Within days, the damage spread. The Reynolds family issued a public statement distancing themselves from the Wallace Company, citing differences in business ethics. Sophia went further, posting a photo online of her engagement to her real partner, captioned simply, "My choice." It was the match to the gasoline. Without the alliance, the merger collapsed. Without the merger, several pending deals fell apart. Investors began pulling out, and rumors of a leadership shakeup swirled until the company's board released an official notice. Richard Wallace would be retiring early for personal reasons. Daniel called me late one evening, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. He didn't defend his father. He didn't excuse the decisions. He just said he finally understood why I'd seemed so guarded for so long. There was no victory in his tone, just resignation. I didn't celebrate, not out loud. But inside, I felt the weight of months of subtle battles lifting. I had wanted Richard to see that power built on manipulation was temporary, that no one is untouchable when the truth is given room to breathe. Now, standing in the wreckage of his own making, he was learning that lesson in full. Karma didn't come for Richard Wallace with fire and sirens. Came the way frost claims a window, slowly, quietly, until one day the glass is covered and you can't remember when it started. In the weeks after his retirement, the Wallace name became something different. Still carried weight, but not the kind that made people lean forward. Now it made them lean back. Conversations paused when it was mentioned. Invitations stopped arriving. The man who had once orchestrated every social and professional circle now found himself standing outside them. I saw him one last time by chance. It was in the lobby of a downtown hotel. He was alone, leaning against a marble pillar, scrolling through his phone like it might anchor him. His suit was still immaculate, his hair still in place, but the confidence, the quiet certainty that had once filled every inch of him was gone. When his eyes met mine, there was no challenge, no subtle game. Just a man who knew the board had shifted for good. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. Some things are better left in silence, and this was one of them. Sophia moved on with her life, openly and freely. Her wedding was small, intimate, untouched by business interests. She sent me a thank you card, not for helping her escape, but for believing her when it would have been easier not to. Daniel and I parted ways in the months that followed. There was no fight, no bitterness. He needed to rebuild his life without his father's shadow, and I needed to live without the constant hum of someone else's control. We left each other with respect, and that was enough. In my own life, the absence of Richard's interference was almost startling. Work felt lighter. Clients came back. Friends who had pulled away started calling again. It wasn't dramatic, it was just space returning, like oxygen filling a room after a long fire. And in the quiet, I realized something important. Richard had taught me the cost of letting someone else write your story. He had tried to erase me, but all he'd really done was sharpen the edges of who I was willing to be. For a long time, I'd imagined karma as a thunderclap, a single powerful strike. But watching his downfall, I saw it differently. Karma is patient. It's the slow dismantling of the walls people build to hide the truth. It's the way seeds of deceit eventually grow into vines that choke the very hands that planted them. Richard Wallace's empire hadn't collapsed overnight, it had rotted from the inside, and all I'd done was make sure the light could reach it. And when the dust settled, I walked forward knowing this. I hadn't just survived him. I'd outlasted him.